eternal in its scope, and personal in its nature. Let me say that again. The can and will change everything. The kind of good news that I need and you need and the world around us needs, that kind of news, it can't just be something we conjure up as human beings. No, it has to be something that is divine in origin, something that is personal in its scope, and ultimately something that is personal in its nature. What was the good news that Paul heard that so transformed not just his life, but the life of countless others down through the ages? Well, that's what we want to consider this afternoon. First off, consider with me the fact that the good news that we need is not man's idea. The good news that we need is not man's idea. Can I point you back to verse 1 of the passage that we read? Verse 1. Paul says that he was set apart, and this is the phrase I want to focus on, he was set apart for the gospel of God. That he was set apart for what he describes as the gospel of God. That this good news, that's all the word gospel means, good news, that this good news didn't start with him, it started with God. Christians who use the term good news, sometimes we can give the perception that this term gospel is a uniquely Christian word. It's a uniquely churchy word. Well, that's kind of true as far as it goes. But actually, this word gospel, this word good news, started off as just an everyday regular word. It wasn't a uniquely religious term. It wasn't a uniquely spiritual term. It was a term that was actually used for when kings would go to war and they would have a victory. Well, those victories needed to be announced to their people. So what would they do? They would send people out into the various towns and villages, and they would announce this good news. That's what this word is. And the early Christians, recognizing that they had a message of a victory that was way bigger than any military victory, early Christians, as it were, they co-opted this term and made it their own. And so when Paul says that he's set apart for the gospel of God, he's saying, I'm set apart for good news that doesn't come from men, it comes from God. This message is not a message that starts with human ideas. It's not a philosophy, just some wise thoughts about the way the world is. It's not a self-improvement program. Here's some do's and some don'ts. Follow these and you'll have a better life. It's thankfully not a government scheme. We all know that those ultimately don't work. Ultimately, the gospel, the good news, is a message about God and from God. As one Christian teacher put it, the gospel is not a religious message to inform mankind of their divinity or to tell them how they may become divine. The gospel proclaims a God who is utterly distinct from men. Now, you may hear that and say, wait a minute, Kofi. That doesn't sound like good news. Actually, the way you put that sounds kind of demeaning. I mean, surely if this is good news, not be about